The first wax corpse moved on the third night. Not a jump scare, nothing like the movies. It was old Colonel Harrison, the one from Gettysburg, whose right index finger, previously pointing rigidly towards some imagined horizon of victory, now rested lightly on his pistol holster. A minimal shift, almost imperceptible. Almost. But I saw it. Robert Callahan, 54 years old, night guard at the decaying Wax Museum of Liberty in Pittsburgh, saw it. That inch of aged wax changing place in the absolute silence of the dead of night planted an ice seed straight into my marrow. The job was a lifeline after the steel mill shut down, after the debt started strangling my life back in McKeesport. I needed it, that smell of ancient dust, mildew, and melted wax, that paycheck that barely covered the rent and the electric bill. I needed to ignore the persistent chill at the back of my neck. The first few nights were just darkness and solitude. The museum was a dimly lit tomb, a maze of rooms housing faded historical figures, forgotten celebrities, and famous crime scenes that seemed even more macabre under the weak glow of the energy-saving bulbs. The air conditioning, a dying tractor, grumbled in the basement, but its icy breath barely reached the upper galleries. The silence was a living thing, thick, heavy. I heard things on the fourth night. Whispers. Not discernible words, but a low murmur, a rustling of muffled voices coming from the Hall of Presidents. When I entered, my flashlight cutting the darkness like a knife, I only found Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Teddy Roosevelt, frozen in their eternal poses, glass eyes reflecting my own light, my own panicked face. I thought it was fatigue, stress. But the ice seed already had roots. It was in the crime room that the true terror began to take shape. The victim from the Black Dahlia case, that female figure with an expression of eternal shock, frozen at the moment of murder. Her eyes, once merely wide with fear, one night seemed deeper. A genuine anguish, a silent plea sculpted in the wax. And that wasn't all. Her posture, once recoiling, now seemed slightly hunched forward, as if trying to escape something behind her. I checked the logbook. The reference photo's old manager, Mr. Henderson, had left. There was no doubt. Someone, or something, was altering the figures. My patrols, once mechanical, became a ritual of terror. Every room I entered was a plunge into anxiety. The flashlight trembled in my hand. My shoes echoed on the worn marble corridors like hammer blows on a coffin lid. And the whispers returned, more frequent now, always coming from a different room, always stopping when I arrived. But the centerpiece of my nightmare was the figure in room 7. The plain man. He wasn't in any catalog, any list. He was just an ordinary man, dressed in simple clothes from an undefined era, maybe the 40s or 50s. He stood near the back of the room, partially turned away from the door, his head slightly tilted, as if observing something on the floor. His face, seen in profile during my patrols, was neutral, almost expressionless, harmless, until I noticed the pattern. Every night, when I started my 2 a.m. patrol, I mentally measured the distance between the plain man's feet and the control room door, located in the opposite corridor, across the central lobby. The control room was my refuge, my cubicle with outdated monitors, a thermos of bitter coffee, and a metal door I locked religiously. On the first night I noticed, the plain man's feet were exactly 18 feet from the threshold of the control room door. Precise measurement, done with the calibrated steps of someone who's patrolled the same floor for weeks. The next night, 17 feet and 3 inches. Then, 17 feet. Inch by inch, night after night, the wax figure was moving towards my door. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't fatigue. It was a glacial, deliberate, impossible movement. When I checked the grainy images from the security cameras, always static, always showing the figures in their correct positions from the previous day, the chill down my spine turned to icy sweat. The system didn't record the movement, but my eyes, my measurements, did. The plain man was coming. and his expression, glimpsed when the flashlight hit him head-on during patrol, began to change. The neutrality gave way to something subtly expectant. A slight curve to the lips that wasn't a smile, but anticipation. The silent malice of a predator approaching its prey's burrow. Fear became a constant companion, a metallic taste in my mouth. The light in my refuge, the control room, seemed dimmer, yellower, unable to chase away the shadows lengthening in the corridors. The whispers now mingled with other sounds. Dragging footsteps when I knew I was alone. A faint scuffing sound in the hallway right after I'd passed. A muffled door slam from some closed room. The figures didn't just change position or expression. They seemed to be watching me with a palpable intensity. I felt the weight of the glass eyes following me when my flashlight beams swept over them. The smiling girl from the old Marlboro Man ad now had a gleam in her eyes bordering on frantic. Elvis Presley, immortalized mid-scream, seemed to contain true panic in his wax throat. The museum was no longer a place of dead memories. It was a hive of slumbering presences waking with the fall of night, with my arrival. I was the intruder. I was the spectacle. And as you hear this story, perhaps in your safe home, with the lights on, doing something routine, feel that familiar shiver. That primal instinct hinting that abandoned places, motionless humanoid figures, and absolute darkness form a dangerous combination. Hold on to that feeling. It exists for a reason. It protected us from things we don't understand, from things that move in the half-light when no one is watching. If you heard a strange noise just now, a creak in the woodwork, a faint whisper, maybe it's just your house settling. Or maybe it's the echo of my terror crossing the void, a warning. Look at your bedroom door. Is it as far away as it seemed a few minutes ago? Return to the story. He's still there. Last night was the peak. The plain man was barely 5 feet from my door. His position was undeniable. He was no longer partially turned away. He was almost facing the control room door, his head still tilted, but those glass eyes, those lifeless glass eyes, seemed fixed on the doorknob. His expression was now one of pure, unquestionable hunger, an avidity that transcended wax and dust. His fingers, once relaxed at his sides, were slightly flexed, like claws ready. The air in the lobby felt thick, hard to breathe, charged with a malignant intent radiating from that figure. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird. The coffee in the thermos tasted like ashes. The monitors showed only the motionless figures, paused in innocent poses I knew were lies. The plain man didn't appear in the lobby camera angle, only his elongated, distorted shadow from the emergency lights angle, a black stain that seemed to breathe. The whispers were now a constant chorus, a buzz of angry, hungry voices coming from all directions, echoing inside my skull. They weren't external sounds anymore. They were internal. It was the museum talking to me, through them. I made my final patrol like a condemned man walking to the gallows. Every step in the corridor echoed like thunder. Every open door was an entrance to hell. The flashlight, once my weapon against the dark, seemed to attract the shadows, making them dance and writhe on the walls, taking monstrous shapes that vanished when the light passed. I avoided room 7. I couldn't look at him again. I knew he was there, closer than ever. I knew if I looked, I'd see something in his eyes that would make me scream myself voiceless. I ran back to the control room, stumbling, sweat pouring down my face, panic a silent scream in my throat. I locked the door with all the bolts, leaned my back against it, sliding down to the cold floor. The darkness outside was palpable, alive. The whispers intensified, turning into a low roar of waves crashing against the door. I heard footsteps outside, not mine. They were dragging, heavy, calculated. They stopped right in front of my door. A silence more terrifying than any noise descended on everything. The air stopped. Time stopped. My heart stopped, and then a sound. The most delicate and horrendous sound I've ever heard. The faint scraping of something, perhaps a fingernail, perhaps a piece of hardened wax, sliding slowly, inch by inch, against the metal surface outside my door. A patient, persistent, insane scratching, scraping, testing, searching for a weakness. He is here, on the other side. He knows I'm here, and he isn't leaving. The scratching continues. It's the sound of my end approaching, inch by inch, in the absolute silence of the dead of night, in the rotten heart of the Wax Museum of Liberty. The bitter coffee turned to poison in my mouth. The job I needed so badly is now my death sentence. The whispers are voices inside my head now, saying he will get in, that the wax is cold, that glass cuts. The scratching on the door is the only truth. He is coming. He will get in. And when that door gives way, when the metal groans and the bolts fail, it won't be Robert Callahan, night guard, that he finds. It will only be more wax, still warm, ready to be molded into a new expression of eternal terror, to join the silent chorus of the museum. The scratching continues. It hasn't stopped. It never stops. It's the sound of my final watch. It's the sound of the plain man, outside, hungry. And he isn't leaving. The name was Endless Sea, but that night, the Atlantic seemed to have found its limit. I remember as if it were yesterday the first time I saw the ocean devour a man. It was my Uncle Ralph, dragged into the deep green-black depths during a sky-splitting storm when I was 12. Now, decades later, commanding my own fishing trawler, the Good Savior, with John, Mark, and Charles, I felt that same tightness in my chest, that same ancient voice whispering that the sea doesn't forgive, it only waits. The fog arrived without warning, as it often does near the Kent coast, close to Dover. A damp, icy shroud that swallowed the stars first, then the horizon, and finally, even the comforting sound of waves against the hull. We were enveloped in a silence as thick as the mist itself, only the muffled rumble of the Good Savior's engine trying to pierce the wet darkness, a sound that suddenly felt too small, too fragile. It was John who saw it first. His finger, thick and scarred from fishing lines, pointed forward, visibly trembling. It wasn't a trick of the mist or tired eyes. Emerging slowly from the white veil like a bloated corpse surfacing, was a freighter. Oh, painfully ancient. The paint, where it still clung, flaked away in large plates like necrotic skin, revealing rust beneath, rust that looked like it had consumed decades, perhaps centuries. Silence. No lights, no movement, no sign of life. Just that black hull, imposing and menacing, drifting across our path like a macabre obstacle placed by the ocean itself. The air grew colder, a cold that penetrated clothes and bit into flesh. The silence around the freighter wasn't passive, it was watchful. It was a silence that observed. The decision to investigate was made in a collective whisper, a stupid impulse fueled by fear and a morbid curiosity that overrode survival instinct. Our small rubber dinghy cut through the still, icy water, the sound of the oars like shouts in the vacuum of the fog. Climbing the rope ladder dangling from the endless sea's hull was like scaling the flank of a slumbering leviathan. The deck, when we finally set foot on it, was a scene of abandonment frozen in time. Old ropes, shriveled like dried intestines, lay scattered across the rusted metal floor. Cabin doors hung wide open, swaying slightly with the freighter's almost imperceptible roll, creaking with a sound like grinding teeth. But it was inside, in the narrow, dark corridors, that the true ice settled in. The smell was the first warning. Not the expected mold, but a sickly sweet odor, like recent food, perhaps meat, mixed with a strong chemical disinfectant that couldn't mask something deeper, more animal. Tables in the mess hall held plates still with food scraps, food that didn't look old. A coffee cup, half full, sat beside an open newspaper. The newspaper, dated just 3 days prior. 3 days. Signs of life brutally interrupted, frozen in an instant. There was no blood, no struggle, just absence. An absence that weighed heavier than any physical presence. The corridor led to the cabins. The first door was ajar. Inside, an unmade bed, personal clothes thrown over a chair, a pair of reading glasses on a table. Everything indicated someone had risen in haste. But to where? And why? The feeling of being watched intensified, a physical pressure on our backs, as if the shadows in the deepest corners of the corridor contracted, breathed. It wasn't paranoia. It was the visceral certainty that something was wrong, deeply, irredeemably wrong. Something beyond our understanding. The flight back to the Good Savior was an act of contained panic. We rode with strength born of pure terror, our eyes fixed on the monstrous silhouette of the freighter slowly dissolving back into the mist behind us. The relief at stepping onto the familiar deck of our boat was fleeting, a small wave breaking against an iceberg. It was Mark, the youngest, always with the sharpest eyes, who let out the hoarse cry. "She's coming after us." He didn't need to point. We all saw. The endless sea was no longer adrift. She was moving. Slowly, inexorably, cutting through the mist like a silent hunter. And worse. Much worse. Lights now flickered in her portholes. Weak yellow lights that seemed to come from candles or rusted bulbs, casting irregular, grotesque shadow patterns on the misty curtains. And in those portholes, shapes moved. Indistinct shadows, humanoid perhaps, but with a strange, disjointed fluidity. They passed before the lights, blocking them for an instant, only to reappear further along, taller, more distorted. They weren't shadows cast by objects. They were shadows with volition, watching us from their ghostly hull. The Good Savior's engine roared, protesting as I pushed it to the limit. But the ancient freighter, that colossus of rotten steel, kept pace. She didn't gain rapidly, but she didn't lose ground. It was a calculated pursuit, a perverse game. The mist had become our prison, and the endless sea, our jailer. You out there, safe in your home, maybe listening to this with a cup of tea, might think the sea is just water and salt. But I am here now, looking back, and I see those lights getting closer through the fog. I see the shadows dancing on that cursed deck. They know we are watching. I feel their gaze, a physical weight on the nape of my neck. And I ask you, what would you do if the darkness you always feared wasn't hidden under your bed, but was out there, in the vast unknown, and it was coming? For you, the night had completely swallowed the horizon. The Good Savior, our refuge of steel and wood, felt ridiculously small, a fragile toy in the claws of the ocean and the thing pursuing us. The constant rumble of our engine was now a lament of fear, a sound trying to drown out the oppressive silence emanating from the freighter. The lights of the endless sea didn't blink like those of a normal ship. They pulsed, a sickly, yellowish luminescence that seemed to breathe in sync with the shadows writhing behind the grimy portholes. It was impossible to discern details, only silhouettes too tall, contorting with movements that defied human anatomy. Arms that seemed to stretch too far, heads that tilted at impossible angles. Sometimes, a shadow would stop before a porthole, standing perfectly still, and that was when the feeling of being watched peaked, a cold that froze the marrow. Charles tried to keep the radio working, frantically turning the dials, but only static answered, a static that, if you listened too hard, seemed to contain shredded whispers, distant voices screaming in inaudible despair. Nothing, just background noise, or something worse, he murmured, his face under the weak panel light looking like a mask of terror. Mark stood on the aft deck, eyes wide and fixed on the ghostly pursuit, a gutting knife gripped white-knuckled in his hand, a useless talisman against what was coming. John, the oldest, the most experienced, stood beside me in the wheelhouse. His silence was more frightening than any scream. He just stared at the approaching lights, his face etched with a dark acceptance, as if recognizing a long-delayed fate. "Peter," he said, his voice hoarse, carrying the weight of the sea and the years, "that ship, she doesn't want to sink us. She wants company." The implication of those words hit me like a bucket of icy water. Company. Like the crew that vanished, leaving behind plates of food and half-drunk coffee mugs. The endless sea wasn't hunting prey. She was recruiting, or replacing what she'd lost. The mist began to transform. It didn't lift, but grew denser in patches, forming ghostly whirlpools that danced on the water's surface, as if stirred by invisible currents. And it was from within one of these misty vortices that a new horror emerged. First, it was just a sensation, a shift in air pressure, a sudden nauseating smell of rotten brine and something metallic, like old blood. Then, shapes began to coalesce in the water, around the freighter's hull. Not waves. They were conglomerations. Dark, viscous patches clumping together, rising from the black depths. Formless, tentacled things, made of wet shadow and marine detritus. Seaweed tangled in their fleeting bodies. Pieces of torn netting seemed part of them, and encrusted shells gleamed like multiple blind eyes under the endless sea's sickly light. They didn't swim. They slithered. They moved with a sinister fluidity, a rhythmic pulsing that echoed the freighter's pulsing lights. There was no doubt. They were coming for us. They were creatures of that ship, extensions of its darkness, sent to encircle the good Savior, to stop us from fleeing. The first impact against our hull was a dull thud, followed by a slow, wet dragging, as if something huge and slimy was trying to climb. The terror, until then a constant presence, exploded into pure panic. Mark screamed, slashing at the water with his knife, but the blade passed through the liquid shadow without resistance. The thing just regrouped, more determined. Another dark form surfaced to starboard, then another to port. We were being surrounded by nightmares born of the mist and the cursed hull hunting us. The good Savior's engine roared, protesting, the propeller churning against these semi-solid entities, but the boat barely moved, as if stuck in amber. The lights of the endless sea were closer now, much closer. The shadows in the portholes seemed to be laughing, a frenzied dance of perverse triumph. The mist tightened its siege, pressing us against the hull of our pursuer. The air became unbreathable, laden with the smell of the sea's death and the static electricity of fear. I looked at my men, their faces distorted by horror, knowing mine must mirror it. The endless sea wouldn't give us the sea as a tomb. She wanted us to be part of her realm of gloom. Her ghostly deck was almost within reach of ours. And up there, on the rusted gunwale, the shadows gathered, elongated, faceless silhouettes, arms stretching towards us, not as a threat, but as a macabre invitation. An invitation to eternity within the mist. The cold I felt then wasn't from the ocean. It was the touch of the void, of the oblivion that inhabited that ship, extending its invisible fingers to pull us inside. The engine's roar turned into a groan of agony. The lights of the endless sea filled my entire field of vision, blinding and repulsive. The shadows in the water gripped the hull with tentacle strength. And the silence, that watchful, hungry silence, finally enveloped us completely. The last thing I heard, before the mist swallowed even the sound of my own desperate heart, was a single, shrill, inhuman shriek from high on the freighter. A shriek that sounded like triumph. The first transmission came on a night when the wind howled like a wounded animal around my monitoring cabin. I, Thomas Evans, had been alone for 37 days in the heart of Dartmoor National Park, Devon. My only link to the world was the old ham radio, a noisy companion full of static that decided to whisper something different that night. It wasn't the weather reports from Exeter, nor the casual chatter of other operators scattered across the moors. It was a scream, distorted, as if fed through a sonic meat grinder, drawn out, laden with an agony that froze the blood in my veins before my brain could even process the sound. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then, silence. A watchful silence, heavy, denser than the pitch black outside. I blamed fatigue. Prolonged isolation plays tricks. I took a sip of cold tea, my hands slightly trembling over the radio controls. The cabin, a timber structure weathered by the damp moorland air, creaked with the wind. The environmental monitoring equipment, temperature, humidity, air quality sensors, blinked with a hypnotic, useless regularity on the opposite wall. My refuge. My voluntary prison. The job was simple: record data and send it weekly to headquarters in Plymouth. A simplicity that crumbled that night. The transmissions returned. Not every night, but often enough to erode my sanity. Sometimes it was numbers. A monotonous, emotionless voice repeating sequences in different languages I barely recognized. 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. In English. Then, the same numbers in a slurred Spanish. Later, in something that sounded like German or Russian. A numerical litany echoing into the void of the frequency, ignoring my attempts at contact, at questioning. Other times, it was whispers. Unintelligible, sibilant words, as if someone had their lips pressed to the microphone on the other side of an abyss. An intimate, threatening presence emanating from the speaker. The worst, however, was the voice that dictated coordinates. Clear, precise, in perfect, almost robotic English. 50 degrees north, 3 degrees 50 minutes west. I wrote them down automatically, cold sweat trickling down my spine. I unfolded the topographic map of the park, my fingers smudged with ink and nerves. The marked point was less than 3 miles from the cabin, in the heart of an area locally known as Silent Combe, a stretch of dense, boggy moorland where even the birds seemed to avoid singing. A place with bad stories, whispered by the few old residents of Tavistock, the nearest town, 2 hours down a dirt track. It was after that transmission that the equipment began to rebel. The laptop, vital for reports, switched itself off without reason. The fluorescent lights in the cabin flickered like dying fireflies, plunging everything into dancing shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The radio, my old companion and now my source of terror, developed a life of its own. It turned on by itself in the dead of night, vomiting pure static, white noise that hammered my eardrums and seemed to vibrate in the bones of my skull. Once, I woke to find it tuned to a dead frequency, emitting only a low, constant hum, like the snore of a sleeping beast. Turning it off brought momentary relief, but the fear of missing a crucial transmission, maybe a real distress call amidst this madness, always made me switch it back on. It was a sick dependency, an addiction to my own poison. The feeling of being watched became constant. More than just observed, I felt studied, dissected. When I went out to check the external sensors, the dense moor seemed to hold its breath. The usual noise of insects, small animals, vanished. Only silence remained. A thick, physical silence, as if the air had solidified. It was in these moments I felt, with a visceral and terrifying certainty, that something moved among the tors and gorse. Something large. Something that made no sound as it moved. I saw no defined shapes, just dark shapes merging with the deepest shadows, peripheral movements that ceased the instant I turned my head. A presence radiating a coldness beyond the ambient temperature, an ancient, patient malevolence. The transmissions began to personalize. The whispers, once unintelligible, now sometimes sounded like fragments of my name. Thomas. Drawn out like a sigh from a grave. Evance. Echoing in the static. One night, after another numerical sequence, the whispering voice added, clear as shattered glass, "Are you alone, Thomas?" That simple question, delivered in a flat tone, was more terrifying than any scream. It was as if the thing outside, the thing tuned to my vital frequency, knew exactly of my isolation, my vulnerability. Knew and delighted in it. Fear crystallized into paranoia. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the cabin's aged timber was an approaching footstep. Every owl's hoot on the roof was a claw trying to scratch its way in. I kept the fire axe beside the bed, but its solidity was fragile comfort. How do you fight something that manifests through radio waves and shadows? I began to see patterns where perhaps none existed. The repeated numbers seemed like dates, coordinates of ancient disasters. The whispers, fragments of forbidden prayers or names of people missing on the moor. The mind, under extreme pressure, builds its own prisons. The peak of physical horror came on a rainy dawn. The power failed, plunging the cabin into total darkness, save for the radio's weak red emergency light. Rain lashed the corrugated iron roof like an enraged mob. And then the sound came. Not from the radio. From outside. A heavy, deep impact against the west wall of the cabin. Timber groaning under pressure. As if a telephone pole had been ripped out and thrown against the shack. The shock was so violent it sent reagent bottles tumbling from a shelf, shattering on the floor with a death rattle. I froze, clutching the axe, eyes straining to pierce the dark. Breath caught in my chest. Nothing. Silence. Just the rain. And then, a slow, heavy dragging sound along the side of the cabin. As if something colossal, something that shouldn't exist, was circling my flimsy fortress, studying its walls, testing its strength. The smell invaded the cabin even with the windows shut, wet earth rotting, decaying bracken, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old blood. That night, sitting on the cold floor, back against the bed with the axe on my lap, the radio dead from lack of power, I realized the most terrifying truth. These weren't random transmissions I was picking up. It was communication. Someone, or something, was trying to speak to me. Specifically to me. Tuned not just to my radio's frequency, but to the frequency of my own fear. It knew I heard. It knew I was listening. And it was getting closer, not through the moor, but through the very air, through the waves carrying its distorted voice and cursed numbers. And here, a pause. You listening to this, comfortable in your home, with lights and company. Ever felt that chill on the back of your neck, that sudden irrational certainty something watches you from the shadows? Multiply that by 1,000, wrap it in a deathly silence and the smell of rotting earth, and you might begin to understand the taste of my hell. The following days were a waking nightmare. The transmissions ceased, replaced by an electronic silence even more disturbing. But the presence outside didn't diminish. It intensified. I felt it constantly, a pressure in the air, an oppression that made it hard to breathe. The equipment died completely. Even the emergency generator refused to start, its innards inexplicably corroded, as if submerged in acid for years. I was utterly isolated. No communication. No power. Trapped in the green claustrophobia of the moor with something that walked in ever-tightening circles around the cabin. Marks began to appear. Deep gouges in the sodden earth around the cabin, too deep for any known animal. Thick gorse branches snapped like twigs, some 3 meters off the ground. And the smell. Always the smell. Decay and rust. It permeated everything, my clothes, my skin. Washing with cold water from the tank didn't remove it. Last night was the climax. I woke to a sound on the roof. An immense weight settling onto the fragile corrugated iron. I heard it groan, buckle. Dust rained from the ceiling onto my bed. I lay still, my heart a drum of panic in my throat. A long metallic scrape tore the silence, like huge claws being dragged slowly, deliberately, across the metal from one end of the roof to the other. Then, silence. A torturous wait. Until the sound changed. No more scraping, but knocking. Firm, spaced knocks on the center of the roof. Thud, thud, thud. As if something enormous was tapping with the tip of a finger, testing the resistance, drawing my attention upward. I slept no more. I sat huddled in the farthest corner, eyes fixed on the ceiling that seemed to bow under the invisible weight. The knocking continued intermittently until dawn. When the first gray light of day broke through the thick mist, the weight on the roof vanished. The silence returned, but it was the silence of a battlefield after the slaughter, heavy with what happened and what is yet to come. Now, I am here, writing this in my logbook by the light of a torch whose batteries are dying. There is no hope of rescue. My last attempt to reach the nearest ranger post on foot ended before I even left the clearing, when I felt that intense watchfulness and heard a sharp crack of a breaking branch in the dense scrub, far too loud for any animal. I ran back to the cabin, bolting the door behind me, knowing it was useless. The radio came back on by itself a few minutes ago. There is no power, but it is on, its red light blinking faintly. No sound comes from the speaker. Just that pulsing light, like a heartbeat, or a beacon, or an invitation. I know I won't leave here alive. Whether by madness, starvation, or whatever is out there, tuned to my frequency, waiting patiently at the edge of the trees. It has won. This record, if ever found, is my testament. Don't look for me on the moor. Don't follow any coordinates transmitted by radio in remote areas. And most importantly, never ever underestimate the silence of the wilderness. It is never truly empty. Something always listens. Something always watches. Something always draws near. The torch is flickering. The battery is almost dead. The radio just emitted a low click, like the sound of a switch being thrown inside the speaker. The red light stopped blinking. It stayed on, steady. And now I hear a whisper beginning to form in the static. It's my voice. It's using my voice.